I want to turn our attention now to the Taiwan Strait, where last month, China launched one of the largest military exercises in recent memory, nearly encircling Taiwan with dozens of warships and fighter jets. This exercise, dubbed Joint Sword 2024A, oh, that's a catchy name, and it kind of implies that there'll be a 2024B, C, D, and well, you know the rest of the alphabet. Anyway, it was in response to the inauguration of Taiwanese President Lai Ching-te, who Beijing sees as a pro-independence leader challenging its one China policy and threatening regional stability. That's from China's viewpoint. The exercise has led many analysts to suspect that China might go for an economic blockade instead of a full-scale military invasion. But my next guest argues that this approach is unlikely to succeed and would probably lead to war. Joining me now is the co-founder of the cybersecurity firm CrowdStrike and author of the book World on the Brink: How America Can Beat China in the Race for the 21st Century. I'm very pleased to have Dmitri Alperovitch on the show. Dmitri, thanks so much for joining us here on the Situation Report.
So good to be with you. Thanks for having me.
Now, here's the top line question, and you run with it in any direction you want to. Is Xi Jinping's China, are they going to invade in some fashion Taiwan?
Look, I think he wants to. I think he's determined to take Taiwan. Now, he would prefer to do it peacefully. As Clausewitz famously said, every aggressor wants to conquer their neighbors peacefully without opposition. But Xi Jinping also said that if he can't do it peacefully, that he will use force. And they've been preparing the military for 40 plus years to do this operation, which is very, very difficult to pull off. We should not underestimate the level of difficulty here. This would be, if they go for it, probably the most difficult operation ever conducted in military history to take the island of Taiwan. But he wants to do it, and I think he wants to do it in his lifetime and while he's still in power so he can get credit for it. He's very ego-driven, and of course, he's up for re-election in the Chinese Communist Party in 2027, very likely to get another 5-year term. But in 2032, he'll be 79. And in their system, perhaps unlike our system, they don't tend to elect leaders into their 80s. So I'm very worried that that sort of period 28 through 32 is the window for him to potentially launch this invasion.
Okay, well, I mean, for what it's worth, I think you're spot on in terms of this idea that he wants to do it while he's in charge. It's going to be his legacy. And I think, people had talked about when could this happen. And the timeline was always fairly well extended out into the future, but that's been compressed of late, I think. So you argue that, if it's not a military invasion and it's an economic blockade, that the end result could still be the same, a full-out war.
Yeah, I do not believe that Taiwan will surrender to an economic blockade for several reasons. First of all, there's no historical precedent in modern times for cities, much less countries, and Taiwan is a nation of 24 million people surrendering just because their economy is going south. You could look at the siege of Leningrad during World War II by the Nazis. 1.1 million people starved to death. The Soviets did not surrender. More recent times, the siege of Sarajevo in the 1990s, 65,000 casualties, but the city did not surrender. So this idea that the Taiwanese would surrender just because their economy is in trouble, particularly when they know the consequences, right? The Chinese make it very clear what they're going to do to the Taiwanese population once they conquer it. They're talking about re-education camps, and if the Taiwanese have any questions about what that means, all they have to do is look across the strait into what's happening in Xinjiang with the Uyghurs and say, you know what, that doesn't really sound that appealing. And Taiwan, really, as I write in my book, is very self-sufficient. So they have ability to produce a lot of food. Now, it's not Wagyu beef, it's not caviar, it's not going to be a luxurious diet, but they produce a lot of rice. They have a lot of fish in their lakes and rivers. They have a lot of vegetable and pineapple production. So they have enough to sustain themselves, even if it's not going to be the most wonderful diet in the world, but they're going to have enough calories. And it's also tropical climate. So even though they're highly dependent on energy imports, they're also not going to freeze to death, unlike, say, the Ukrainians, whose energy grid is being pummeled by the Russians on a daily basis. And they're not surrendering, of course. So I just don't see any possibility for Taiwan to surrender. And then they have options to go offensively to counter-blockade China, because the top 5 Chinese ports are within striking distance of their missiles. And they can do the same thing to China that China is doing to them.
But, I mean, logistically speaking, from an operational perspective as well, what's your assessment? I mean, if you're saying that Taiwan is doing this on their own, I'm just as a scenario. I'm not saying that's what would happen, but realistically, for Taiwan to hold out militarily against China, it doesn't seem to be in the cards.
No, I think that if it's an invasion, not just a blockade, but an actual invasion of the island, Taiwan is going to need help. Now, realistically, they shouldn't need it because, as I mentioned, it's an island of 24 million people. It's a very, very difficult place to invade. And that was deemed too risky and too dangerous by Roosevelt and Douglas MacArthur and others. So we never went through that. So 80 years ago, 300,000 troops needed to occupy an island that at the time had 6 million people on it and the Japanese occupation. Today, even harder than that. So very, very difficult to pull off. And realistically, if Taiwan had focused on their defenses, particularly over the last 20 years, they could defend themselves, but they haven't. And thus, today, they do require support from us to actually defeat this invasion should it ever come.
Yeah, and that support, what's your assessment? Say that it's a blockade. Let's go with that scenario first. It's an economic blockade of Taiwan. What role does the U.S., what role do the rest of the West, what do they play in this? Or do they just stand by and see what happens?
I don't think so, because we are going to be immediately impacted, and the rest of the world is going to be impacted because Taiwan, of course, is the world's chips factory, right? So many of the semiconductors, both advanced and foundational, are being produced in Taiwan. They're absolutely a requirement for the world economy. Some of the estimates are that we would lose trillions of dollars in GDP if there's a blockade or invasion of Taiwan. So, and by the way, China would be heavily impacted as well. So the pressure on them from the rest of the world, including the United States, and even domestically, every single day that this blockade goes by is going to be absolutely immense. And one of the things I argue is that Taiwan can do the one thing that China doesn't want it to do, which is declare independence if this blockade is being instituted against them. And one of the things that the United States could do is threaten that we would recognize that independence and forever change the status quo in the Taiwan Strait if China does not relent and does not abolish this blockade. So not only does Taiwan have enough resiliency to withstand a blockade, but it also has a number of offensive options that could make life very, very difficult for China.
Okay, let's imagine a scenario it's a bit of both, right? It's an economic blockade. There's some military action. Of course, the PLA will be involved in the blockade from the outset. So, it will be a hybrid military and economic effort. Do you see the U.S.? I know this is a tough question, right? Because we don't know what's going to happen in November in terms of the election coming up in the U.S. But do you really see any U.S. administration, whether it's the Biden administration, a possible Trump administration, coming to the aid militarily? I don't mean just having provided resources, but coming to the aid militarily, as we are doing in Ukraine, for Taiwan?
Well, Biden has now said on 5 occasions, and including most recently last week, that he would send American troops to defend Taiwan. But it's a very tough call. I mean, a war with China would be horrendous in terms of loss of life, in terms of devastation to our naval shipping, aviation, and of course, the risk of a conflict with a nuclear power, right? And the risk that it would escalate to a nuclear level. So this is a tough call. It's a tough call for China as well. But this is what China is going to count on, right? China can take Taiwan, as we said, if the U.S. is not going to support it. But it can't count on that today, which is why they haven't launched it yet. And their goal is to increase as much leverage over us as possible, both in the military domain and the economic sphere, to try to deter us from intervening so that they can do this quickly and without a broader war.